Welcome back, dreamers. Your host Ken here with some exciting news that I just couldn't wait to share. Somewhere in Dreamland now has an amazing new merch store filled with custom Somewhere in Dreamland hoodies, t-shirts, coffee mugs, pint glasses, and much, much more. So what are you waiting for? Why not hop on over to dreamlandpodcast.weebly.com and grab yourself or someone else some custom Dreamland gear now. Welcome back, dreamers. Tonight, Preston Dennett joins the show once again to share his insight and research into the UFO and extraterrestrial phenomena that he has studied and written about for over 35 years. So without further ado, grab your blanket, turn down the lights, get comfy, and let's fade away into
Dreamland.
Preston, thank you so much for coming back on and speaking with me, man. I'm excited about this opportunity. I had such a great time talking with you the first time we talked. I feel like I'm never going to have enough time to, get everything out of you that I can. So we'll give it we'll take it small chunks at a time. How's that sound?
Sounds great to me. Yeah. Thanks, Ken. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So what are you working on now? I know you released The Wondrous, and that was a great book. And I think we spoke about that last time you were on. You working on anything right now?
I am. I'm a little bit behind schedule. I'm interviewing this lady by the name of Dolly. She's originally from Florida. And, wow, I can't tell you what a treat it is to interview this lady. She's a fully conscious contactee. And there aren't a lot of them out there. I mean, I've talked to hundreds of people, and pretty much everyone that I've talked to has been, taken on board has some memory problems at some point, missing time. Oh, I mean, they might remember good portions of their experience or even have fully conscious experiences, but even then they still have missing time. Not Dolly. She has been fully conscious since age 14. I'm about on page 140 of the book. So it's getting close, but I still have like 100 pages of interview to put in. So this is going to be a pretty amazing book.
That is super fascinating. And I am very excited to get a chance to read that, man. I can't wait. And that's kind of one of the things. It's cool that you brought that up because I have a couple of questions for you about, screen memories and things like that I know that you have a lot of insight on. So it's cool how that fit together.
Screen memories are pretty interesting. I've heard a lot of variations of the, screen memories. Clowns comes up a lot, particularly for kids, which is kind of interesting because, there's a lot of fear of clowns in our society.
Yeah. I heard somebody seen Big Bird one time, and cartoon characters are pretty regular too, aren't they?
Yep. Superheroes, Barbie dolls. I think my favorite that anyone ever told me was teddy bears. 3-foot tall teddy bears came walking into her room.
Wow. Listen, but that would creep me the hell out, man. I'd be gone. I'd be so, no way. I wouldn't want any of those. If I wake up and see Big Bird at the end of my bed, it's done. It's over.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how I'd react, but Big Bird. Yeah, that I have not heard. But I've heard so many variations. Owls, of course, animals of all kinds, monsters, vampires, this sort of thing. Clowns is probably the most frequent. And that's kind of creepy.
Yeah, it is.
Uh,
the vampire thing is creepy too. Like I couldn't imagine waking up and seeing a vampire. I don't know how I would react to that. Like that would, do you think that they do that because they think people enjoy them? They're like, they have a, pop culture kind of thing and they're thinking they're just maybe using items from pop culture? Or do you think somehow they access these people's memories and see their fondnesses of things? I mean, how do you think that works?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speculate, but I think there's some good evidence that that's exactly what's going on. The vampire thing, I'm thinking it's probably more of a person's fear reaction, and that's sort of what they overlaid, what they saw. So that came more from them, I'm thinking, in the ETs. But particularly with the clowns, I'm thinking, well, the ETs are studying culture. They're looking at circuses and like, well, kids love clowns. Let's try to reduce the fear factor.
Yeah.
And the reason I think that that's probably what's going on is because there's a case involving, I think it's Beth Collings from Beth Collings and Anna Jamerson wrote a book called Connections. And she's a horse farmer. And she's having a missing time encounter right near her residence. And up walks this gray, but he's wearing a cowboy hat and a mustache, sort of a pasted on mustache. That was her sort of supposition that they were sort of putting on the cowboy hat to make her think, well, it's just another cowboy coming in.
That is crazy, man. Like, it is weird because I've talked to the people that have had some sort of similar experiences. I mean, with like screen memories, and it's almost at the time that they're having them, they seem legit. And then later on, when they think about them, they're like, oh, wait a minute, that isn't right. How many times do you run into that?
Yeah, and that can be really bizarre. I remember I interviewed this one guy who was with I believe it was his brother in Northern California. They're driving through the mountains and he saw what he thought was a log rolling down the road in front of him. Just like a tree or something. And his friend's like, or his brother's like, no, I saw a cat, a wild cat, a cougar, completely different things. And I interviewed another guy from Everett, Washington. I call him Jack. It's not his real name, but he was with his little brother and his mom. They had just left a drive-in movie because it got all fogged up, and which is definitely a red flag when the fog comes rolling in. And so they're driving home at like 1 mile, well, not one, 3 miles an hour, really slow, creeping along through the thick fog. And his mom stops the car and says, look in front of the car. And his little brother was in the front seat. It's like, oh my God, it's a 3-foot tall spotted skunk. And his mom's like, yeah, I've never seen one that big. And Jack, who's sitting in the back seat, looks over the shoulders. There's nothing there. He's like, I don't see it. They're like, what do you mean you don't see it? It's right there. Boom, a beam of light hits the car, which starts kind of shaking and vibrating, and Jack finds himself getting pulled up into the air, and then boom, it's daylight. They're at their house and they're walking into their home, and at least 6 hours had passed.
Wow.
Yeah. He later recalled spontaneously what happened.
It's really insane. If they are able to do this to you, do you think it's also possible for these things to put these screens on or projections on long enough to like possibly be walking around like amongst us? Yes, I do. And I just did a little study on that. I wrote about it in one of my books. Cause there are several cases where, well, here's one, which kind of really struck me, was a lady who was driving down through, I think this is at Port Lucie in Florida. And a UFO is over her car. And next thing she knows, it's like an hour later and she's pulling into a gas station. And she's a little disoriented, but she's getting gas and coming back to her car after paying. And there's this beautiful blonde-haired, muscular man leaning against the trunk of her car. And she's just entranced by him. And he sort of seduces her.
And she says, honestly, I'm not in the habit of picking up young men, no matter how good looking they are. But she did. And he got in the car. They went home. They ended up having relations. And he's getting up to go to the bathroom. And she wakes up and looks at him. And he still looks normal, from direct vision. But in the mirror, his reflection is not normal. It is a gray. And that freaks her out. And he walks into the bathroom and never comes out. Never comes out. There is no exit to the bathroom. There's no windows. This is a completely enclosed bathroom.
That is insane. I was going to say, Preston, I was never in Florida, so she couldn't have seen me. But no, that is an insane story. You examine that a little bit more and you think, are these things like crossbreeding with us somehow? What was the point in that? They have to be after something. And how often do you hear about things like that? Yeah,
I uncovered a few other cases like that, with ETs walking among us and seducing women. And later, there was one case which was in New York, upstate New York. This was investigated by Hans Holzer, who's normally a ghost hunter, but it did dip into UFOs. And he had interviewed this teenager who was at Westmoreland High School, walking up to go to school like any other normal day. And this weird guy approaches her. He's kind of got white blonde hair. His eyes are a little bit, Asian looking. His skin's not quite normal. His clothes are off. She couldn't quite remember how. But he starts asking her, hey, you want to go on a ride in my car, my white car out over there? And he points to a field. She looks out in the field and she's like, no, thinking this guy is kind of creepy. She's like, I have to go to school. I'm going to PE and I'm going to play volleyball. And he's like, what's volleyball? And started asking her all these bizarre questions about things any normal person would know.
Almost like what the Men in Black would do, something like that, like the weird questions that they would ask.
Right. And so this went on for just a little bit. And finally she's like, this guy's a creep. And she turns around and starts walking into the school and immediately turns around. She says she took like 3 steps, turns around and he's gone. And there's nowhere to run. So that freaked her out. And she walks over to her friends, which were standing there. Like, did you see that guy? And they're like, yeah. Who was that guy? She's like, I don't know. So a few weeks pass and she's in the local convenience store and there's either the same guy or someone very similar staring at her while she's reading a magazine, just staring her down. And she just looked at him and finally it creeped her out. So she left. And then she ended up having an encounter where she was taken on board. And of course, there's the guy who did try to, breed with her, or apparently did. Yeah, we know this as researchers. There's a lot of cases of what we would call the hybrid baby phenomena. And it turns up all the time. My first case was right when I got in this field back in 86. Or actually, I really kind of researched more seriously in around 88. But that was one of my first cases. And it freaked me out. This was before Bud Hopkins' book Intruders had come out, which kind of really was the first to put forth a bunch of cases and say, the Greys are doing this. I'm like, thank God. I thought, I was going nuts. This is insane.
What do you think the purpose of that is? Is it to preserve them or to preserve us or for something different?
I think probably a little bit of both. People talk about, oh my God, what if something bad happens here on Earth and, humanity goes extinct? I'm like, well, I'm not so sure that will ever happen because this is the primary thing that happens when people are taken on board. Genetic material is taken from both men and women. So it's pretty clear that ETs have the material to continue, producing humans. And there are a lot of cases where people have seen absolutely human-looking people on board UFOs. And I've talked to a few people who, talked to these humans on board UFOs who had the impression that these people lived there and never I mean, that's where they spent their entire lives. But I think ultimately what we're looking at here with the hybrid baby phenomena, these are grays who are producing, half human, half gray babies. And the story pretty much is the same from multiple different sources. I talked to one lady who asked them flat out, why are you taking me? What is the deal with this? Because she had a hybrid baby. They showed it to her. They had her hold it, the whole standard scenario of the baby presentation. And they said, we are very interested in your genetics. We have damaged our genetics due to intervention so that we could facilitate space travel. And we removed our emotions, and now we're trying to reintroduce them. We've also lost the ability to reproduce. And so we are basically just trying to reinvigorate our genetics. They told her that they were almost quasi-physical and that we ourselves are much more grounded in the three-dimensional physical plane than they are. And they're trying to sort of reintroduce that. She's like, well, are you going to take over our planet? And they said, no, we have no interest in your planet. You guys are far too emotional. Your planet is very polluted. It's way crowded. And there are many other planets that we can have that we can use.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a really interesting case. This gray, she was in telepathic contact with it, introduced himself. He's like, my name is Sen. She's like, are you my child? He says, no, not as you would think of it, but I am made from your genetics. But you did not actually, bear me.
Wow. That is crazy, man. I often wonder about that. And I wonder, the story you just said would kind of allude to the fact that hybrids wouldn't be here walking around, but do you think that they may be?
Yeah, I think so. There's so many cases of people who are reporting ETs walking among us. And even grays who apparently no one else can see, or I don't know. It's very strange. There was one case that was just so bizarre, but I like it because it comes from John Hunter Gray, who's a great witness, a social worker. He's won awards. He was pretty prominent in the field for a while. And he had a missing time encounter with his son. This is outside of Richland Center, Wisconsin. And it was just your normal sort of missing time encounter. They recalled it afterwards without hypnosis, seeing grays, being taken on board, physically examined, injected. And John Hunter Gray reports that he had like 20 physiological improvements. So sort of a UFO healing case. And that's why I was so interested in it, because I've done a bunch of research into that. Something really weird happened right before this abduction. And it's something that really stuck out in both John Hunter Gray's mind and his son. They were at a gas station in La Crosse and were filling up their car. And there's this guy next to him in a Volvo, and he's staring them down, and he's really short. Like under 5 feet tall. That was peculiar. Another thing that was peculiar was the way he was dressed up. It was a warm day, but he was dressed head to toe, and, you couldn't see any skin on him at all, really. Gloves, scarf, fisherman's cap, sunglasses. They could see his eyes through the sunglasses, and his eyes were weird, John said. And they're like, this guy's acting a little peculiar. And so they fill up the tank and drive off. And this guy starts shuffling to his car in a weird posture. They said, a weird gait. So that was another weird thing they noticed. Like, okay, this guy not only is really short with a weird appearance, dressed strange, yet he's moving strange. So these are all details that turn up in cases like this. And here's where it gets really weird. They're driving along, and this guy's, jumps into his Volvo and follows them, and right behind them. And they're like, well, this guy's following us. Let's slow down. They slow down. He slows down. Will not pass them, no matter how slow they go. So they speed up. He speeds up. this guy was like on their tail for a while and then turns off. And that's when this UFO drops down out of the sky, right after the sky turned off. And there's case after case like this of ETs walking among us. There was another case where a guy's driving along, I think it was the Pacific Coast Highway. And there's these two young sailors who are hitching a ride. He's like, wow, they look pretty young. They almost look like 16 years old. But said that they worked at, I forget the name of the military base, but it was up in Oregon. And it apparently had just been formed. And so he gives them a ride, and they're like, you can let us off here. And he lets them off, and boom, this UFO drops down out of the sky. And he thought that was peculiar because these guys were very similar looking, like people often describe Nordics as looking like twins. Yeah. That's what he said. And he ended up being shipped. He was a military guy himself, which is why he gave him a ride, and ended up going to this same base that they said they were from, where he had an encounter. So there was all these weird synchronicities that, yeah, I think they're among us. I really do. And I know how that sounds, but, David Jacobs has cases, pretty much all researchers have cases like this.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And if you really, really look at the details of some of those cases, in which I have, you start noticing little weird things. Like, it almost always goes back to the eyes. The eyes almost always look weird, right? And the places that they see them, they like, that you would see, like, maybe someone who's putting on this screen memory, or maybe even a hybrid. So many gas station encounters, a lot of gas station encounters. It's really strange, but the eyes, for some reason, everybody always picks those out. And I think that's a detail that almost everybody says, isn't it?
Absolutely. The eyes give them away, and people will say something. There was a lady who encountered one at a deli, and she says the guy had these golden eyes, and they were just hypnotizing and stared right through her. I'm like, yep, that is the description people will often give. They stare right through you. They're very hypnotizing. Debbie Jordan Cobble, who is Bud Hopkins' star client for Intruders and is still on the UFO scene. She wrote 2 books herself, just released one. She had an encounter at Rough River State Park in Kentucky where she was out camping with her friends. They had a little cabin and all. And these guys were on the CB radio with her. And they're just talking. She's like, ha, ha, ha. Yeah, if you can find us, you can come visit us. And boom, they come driving up.
Wow.
Which, should have been impossible because, they had no idea where Debbie was. And it turned out to be these really good looking guys. And that's another description you get. They're often described as very handsome or beautiful.
Yeah, I get that all the time. Everybody thinks I'm an alien, man.
That must be rough. So sorry. I don't get that. I don't understand.
Neither do I. I'm just, trying.
But yeah, she described him as being very handsome. And I hear that from people who see human looking ETs. And she again described their eyes as being strange in a way.
There are tons and tons of stories out there. And I've talked to several people, Preston, that have had strange encounters with, different things. Like, a lady said that she saw she was driving and saw the Wile E. Coyote cross the road in long strides across the road. And then minutes later, she had an encounter with somebody at a gas station that really weirded her out. It's just, there's kind of a little pattern there,
Yeah. One of my favorite cases that I personally investigated like this involved 2 brothers, jewelry makers up in San Francisco. They sell their wares at, I think it's Beach Street, and, just have little jewelry and handmade jewelry and stuff. And had a really weird UFO encounter. It was bizarre because, he's walking along and he kept hearing this thought in his head, don't look up, don't look up. And finally he just looks up and there's a UFO. And he points it out to his brother. And his brother's like, oh, wow. And they're entranced. They're looking at it and it's dropping lower and lower. This is a crowded street during the day. And the guy that I interviewed starts freaking out because it's getting like, 100 feet above him, 300 around there. And he's like, don't abduct me, stop. So it stops. And I think at one point it divides into two and then moves off. And so he turns to his brother and like, I had the weirdest thought before that happened. Kept hearing, don't look up. His brother's like, oh, that's weird because I kept getting a thought too, which is check your shoes. They're untied. Check your shoes. They're untied. And they weren't. They were not untied. He kept looking at him like, huh. It was just this weird reverse psychology thing, I'm thinking. But so it gets weirder, right? And no one else saw the UFO, but it was like some years later, like 10 years later, same place. He's steps away from his booth and it's like another crowded day and he sees this couple wearing trench coats walk up to his booth. And he thinks to himself, oh, I hope they try on my rings. I'd like to sell some stuff because he's watching his booth from a distance and just waiting for someone to approach. When he starts hearing this couple talking in his head, it wasn't clear to him at first, but as he's hearing them talking, it's like he realizes like, shoot, I'm 30, 40, 50 feet away. Should not be able to hear them. And so he's kind of stepping closer and looking to examine them because he's saying like, no, she's like, I want to look at this stuff. And he's like, well, okay, but just for a moment, we really have to get out of here. And that's what he's thinking. Oh, I want you to try on my rings. And she turns around and looks at him and hides her hands from everyone around her by sort of holding them to her chest, pulls them out of her pocket and said, this is why I cannot try on your rings. And no one else can see her hands because, she's got them right up against her chest. And he looks down at her hands and they were not hands like we would think of them. He said, honest to God, these looked more like crow's feet, kind of like claws, black, skinny, clawed-like fingers, really long, just not normal by any means. And so he quickly puts them back in and he's like awestruck. And the guy, these look like pretty much normal people as far as you can tell from that distance, says, we have to go. Tell him not to follow you. And so they start walking and this time they're approaching within, 10 to 20 feet of him. And she says, don't follow. There'll be big trouble. And he says, don't worry, I won't. I can't leave my booth. And she turns and looks right at him. And he said she was attractive, but had huge, dark black eyes, no whites.
Wow.
To them. So yeah, there you go. The eyes giving them away again.
Yeah, man, that's a crazy story, Preston. You have so many great stories, man.
That's a weird one. Usually when I hear a story, it's like, okay, here's details that come up again and again and again. And often I'm like, well, I've heard every single thing that this person is telling me from someone else. But I'm going to say most stories do have unique elements or unusual at least. But that one's off the chart.
Yeah, that's a crazy one.
And every now and then you get one of those. I mean, there was another one because often people will contact me like, oh, I need to know if anyone else has reported this. I think I'm going out of my mind because I can't find any other accounts. And this guy contacts me from Canada. Actually, he wouldn't tell me where he was from. I'm like, can you tell me the country? He's like, no, I don't want to tell you. And I'm like, well, not even the country? He's like, okay, Canada. And I finally got him to admit it was like Ontario. And finally said, well, this encounter occurred on Wasaga Beach, but he doesn't want his name used. And I'm like, fine. Wasaga Beach is huge. It's the largest freshwater beach in Canada. I think it's in the world. It's along Lake Ontario. So at any rate, he's camping with his friends at this sort of resort, cottage where, it's a very touristy place. And he's like, let's take a walk. Let's take a walk on the beach. It's late at night. And his friend's like, no, I don't want to. And he's like, no, I really, really want to. He just had an impulse. And I'm like, ooh, an impulse. He had been doing CE5 work, by the way, and had seen UFOs prior to this and really wanted to see an alien. So I think that might be related to this. Had some childhood encounters with figures in his room. So it's fitting the pattern of a contactee, right? But then this case is so weird. So they're walking along. I think there's 4 of them and him. And he's got his best friend walking right next to them. And they're walking along the beach. And suddenly, people in front of him stop. Just freeze. And he turns to his best friend, and his best friend is frozen in mid-step. And he's like, what's up? Hey, bud, what's up? And they're not moving, but he can move. And I've heard this, from other witnesses. And so he's looking around because the lake isn't moving either. And none of the tree, the leaves, everything kind of rustles a little bit when you're out. And no, everything's completely just frozen. And he says there's this weird energy in the air. It's just, everything's like weird. He says the air was almost crackling with energy. So he's looking around, freaking out when he sees 3 figures down by the water. And they're a good 100 yards away, 300 feet or so. But they look really tall and really strange. They're wearing like black, what look like jumpsuits, and sort of glistening in the light there. There was a moon out, so we could see. And he's looking at them like, God, they look weird. And next thing he knows, he's standing in front of them. He had some confusion. How he got there, does not remember. But he's about 4 feet away from them, 3 feet away from them. They're standing in a triangle formation. And he says they're 10 feet tall, maybe 9, but he's leaning towards 10. I'm like, really? Are you sure? That's really tall. And he says, well, listen, I'm like over 6 feet tall. I'm like 6'3". And they were good 3-4 feet taller than me. I had to look up to look at them. And I'm like, well, what do they look like? And he said, they were scary looking. They were quite tall, slender, wearing this black, glistening, jumpsuit, kind of like nylon or something, but not. It was shiny, is how he said. And what looked like maybe capes or something, but definitely had these high collars around them, sort of like, Dracula, I guess. And he said what really struck them was their face and their eyes. He said their eyes were massive, huge, wrapped around the side of their head. They were basically human looking, or humanoid, I should say. But they had really thick, wrinkly skin. He said these guys must have been 100 years old, 200. That was his impression just looking at their skin, which was thick and wrinkly. And they had dirty, yellow, jagged teeth. And big lips, broad mouth, sort of a long, straight nose, massive eyes with blue and gold lined irises. And he wanted to, talk to them and say, what are you doing here? What's going on? He said what came out of his mouth was, you can't be here. He's not sure why he said that, but I think he's just saying, this can't be happening. Right. What's going on? And they said something which chilled him. They said, we can come and go as we please. Nobody can stop us. It's pretty much a direct quote. And he said they spoke in chorus with this really low, gravelly voice, which reverberated. And I asked him, like, was this telepathic? He's not sure. He felt like it was out loud. But he's honestly not sure because it was in chorus. And freaked him out.
No doubt.
Yeah. So he turns and runs. And this is next thing he knows. He is with his friends and they're all walking back down the pathway to the cottage. And he was going to ask him, like, did you see these guys? Did you see these guys? And he forgot. He forgot everything. He's like, gosh, I just wanted to tell him something. What just happened? Just forgot. Plum forgot. They get to the cottage. He passes out on the couch as soon as he walks in, which was very unusual. 2 weeks go by. They decide to have another vacation. Same cottage, same exact cottage. And as soon as he walks in, he remembers spontaneously. This is what I would call a cue. So people will, see a similar sight and it will bring the memory back. And he's thinking, oh my God, what am I? So he asks his friends, hey, you guys, remember the walk we took a couple of weeks ago on the beach? And they're like, oh yeah, sure. He's like, oh, you do? And they're like, yeah. Do you remember anything weird happening? They're like, no, not really. He says, do you remember seeing anyone else on the beach? And like, oh yeah, there was those weird looking people. Ooh. And you went up to talk to them. And he says, oh, you do remember that. Do you remember what they look like? And they're like, well, no. I mean, they looked a little weird looking. Remember anything else? No. And he didn't want to say, oh, I think they're aliens. Because, he hadn't come out as seeing UFOs to his friends and believing in them. And he didn't want to go there. And they were just all casual. Like, yeah, we saw them. But it was confirmation. But he's like, have you ever heard of anything like this? I'm like, no, I wish I could tell you, but no, I haven't. With the jagged teeth, yellow teeth, thick skin. Never heard anything like that.
Well, now you have. So next time you'll say, yeah, I have heard of something like that.
Yeah, I'm waiting.
How many of those one-off cases do you get, Preston?
It does happen. I mean, I wouldn't particularly call his a one-off because he has a history of encounters. And most people who have face-to-face encounters are particularly on board. I start, making queries, and sure enough, something happened when they're a little kid. But yeah, one-offs do happen. I remember one-off that really interesting to me was a lady I worked with for years. Connie is her name, Connie Lopez. And, my boss, who was, a young man, younger than me, had, knew about my UFO research, was all about it. I actually took him out once to see a UFO. I couldn't believe it. One came down. We were doing CE5 stuff. And, at any rate, he had bought me this statue of a gray. I'm like, oh, cool, thanks. I put it on my desk, and in walks Connie, and she sees the statue and screams. She's like, what the hell is that? I'm like, Connie, what do you mean? What do you think that is? She's like, I don't know, but I saw one. I'm like, oh, you did? I'm like, Connie, that's a gray alien. What did you see? She says, it was years ago. She just had her son. He was a week old. And I'm like, ooh, red flag. Can't tell you how many cases I have, Ken, of people who are 9 months pregnant, 8 months, just had their baby. My own sister had an encounter a week after she had her baby. Same sort of thing. I'm telling you, they are very interested in human reproduction. So Connie had just had her baby. She's sleeping in the master bedroom with her husband, and the baby's in the corner in a crib, right next to a huge picture window. And this is a picture window that's, fixed to the wall. It can't open. There's no way you can open it. It's just a fixed window. And she wakes up in the middle of the night because she hears this squeaky sound, like someone rubbing their fingers against glass, like when you're watching dishes or something. Sure. And she sits up in bed and is looking around and realizes the sound's coming from the window. And it's a 6 foot tall, gray type ET. Couldn't tell if it was wearing clothes or not. If it was very tight jumpsuit. Very much a typical gray, but much taller. But, the large dark eyes, huge head, skinny neck, long, thin fingers and arms. She said there was something weird on its fingers. Like, what do you mean? She says, you know what, those, octopus suckers on the tentacles? I'm like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. She says, those were up and down its fingers, on its fingertips. I'm like, wow, yeah, that's what I thought. Cause I've heard that a few times in other cases. I don't, that was like the first time I ever had a case like that personally. But that turned up in an alien autopsy case with, Leonard Stringfield.
Really?
Yes. So that I found interesting. And so this is so this gray is looking at her baby, looking at the mobile that's hanging above the crib, and is trying to open the window, trying to get to her baby. This is Connie's impression. And she screams, at which point it looks at her. They lock gazes. It slams her into the bed with this pressure, this force, and completely freaks her out. She's like crying, but she can't cry out at this point. She's paralyzed. Tears are pouring from the corners of her eyes. And this thing is trying to open the window that can't be open. This is stupid gray.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, don't they normally just walk through walls? I'm like, well, did you see a UFO? No. Have you ever had an encounter? Nope. Are you sure? No weird, no UFO sightings? Nope. Anyone you know in your family? Nope. Anything happened when you were a little girl? Nope. Anything unexplained? It's like, well, yeah, I did have a ghost encounter once. Like, after her husband died, she had a really profound ghost encounter, or her boyfriend, I forget. But at any rate, this gray tries to get in for about a minute, which is a long time. And finally just walks away. And the paralysis lifts. She jumps up, scoops up her baby, and screams at her husband, who bolts out of bed. He's like, what's wrong? She's like, some weird looking man tried to get into the house. He wants our baby. He's like, what do you mean a weird looking man? She said he was bald. He didn't look normal. She didn't think alien. She hadn't even ever heard really of aliens. Right. This was late 70s, I believe. Could have been 60s. No, I'd have to look it up, but it was well before this was a more popular subject. And she eventually, she went outside. I think it was a day or two later to look for footprints. Didn't see anything. But her husband's like, that was a nightmare, honey. She's like, no, it wasn't. It was not a nightmare. I was awake. I am not staying here. I am going over to my mother's. I'm taking the baby. And she did. And she's like, I'm not coming back, honey, unless we buy guard dogs. And he's like, okay, I understand. And they did. They bought guard dogs. And she's like, I want to move. I can't stay here anymore. Let's move. So they ended up selling their house over this.
Wow.
But yeah, that's a complete one-off.
That's insane. And who knows, maybe she did have some encounter that she just doesn't even remember at some point in her life too,
Yeah, entirely possible. Because so many, I hear it over and over and over again. This happened to Whitley Strieber. He's had encounters his whole life, but it's not until you have this major event that people start to connect the dots. And realize maybe I'm a contactee.
Yeah, sometimes it goes deep, man. So, and it just takes that sometimes all it takes is the certain cue that you were speaking of to set that whole chain of events off as well.
Yeah, like that gentleman who I saw the spotted skunk with his brother and sister was an adult and bit on his tooth, broke his wisdom tooth, and boom, he remembered the 5 hours of missing time, or most of it, where he'd been pulled on board. Can't remember what the ETs look like, other than they were really short, and thinks they were scary looking, and thinks maybe he's blocking it because of that. They were operating on his feet, operating on his mouth. He's freaking out. He's like, you're not going to take my brother and sister. And they're like, no, we have no interest in them. We just want you. They were very unemotional. And one of the Greys is like, we should just drop him off, throw him out. And the other's like, no, we're not going to do that. And just talking weird. And they took him to another room. This is such a weird case. This is another one with weird elements to it. Never heard before or since. They put him in this contraption and dangle him outside of the bottom of the UFO. It was like wearing like a parachute where you have little straps sort of holding you onto the parachute. Yeah. And they're dangling him, and the walls around him turn perfectly clear. It's kind of cone shaped, like he's in the bottom of an ice cream cone or something. And he can see his farmhouse, and he can see the whole area for a good couple of miles. And they drop down and they start pulling electricity out of the telephone lines. And I'm like, wow, this is interesting, because how many times have we heard this? Where people see a UFO and it's sparking on the telephone wires, or just hovering right over the telephone wires, causing a power outage. But here's a guy inside while they're doing it, and they're explaining, they're like, yes, this is what we're doing. He can feel the electricity. His teeth were like ringing. And he said it was a really cold, cold feeling. And they pull him on board and they start communicating with him, shooting all these mathematical formulas, geometric shapes, weird looking architecture, buildings, landscapes, colors, all a bunch of stuff, which basically went right over his head. And then they zoomed off to another area, and that's pretty much all he remembers. But yeah, he no idea he was an abductee. Never really thought about it until he suddenly remembered this. And then boom, 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 all this weird stuff started to make sense. There were crop circles outside his farmhouse. He used to get blamed, like, son, why are you chomping down the wheat in a circle? He's like, I'm not doing it. Look, this thing is 50 feet across. How would I do this? But he'd get blamed for it.
That's great.
He got sucked out of his room once. Didn't want to tell anyone because he didn't know, is this a dream? What's going on? He broke his leg while playing high school football. Broke his foot. Goes to the doctor, and the doctor's like, well, you broke your foot before, huh? He's like, well, no. He says, well, you have a piece of metal in there. He's like, I do. He's like, yeah, you do. And looks like, something's been going on there. Goes to the dentist. The dentist is like, what's this under your tooth? And pulls it out. It's this weird object. And they ended up throwing it away, unfortunately.
Yeah, no doubt, man. That would have been, you'd have been all over that one, Preston.
Yeah. The implant thing turns up in case after case, and often gets thrown out or tossed away, or they'll store it in an envelope and it disappears.
What about like scoop marks and weird shapes on people's skin? How often do you get that?
Regularly. Almost every person who has an onboard experience will report something along those lines. Bruises, triangular mark, scoop mark. It can get really weird. One lady had, the weirdest one I ever heard was just beyond bizarre. I met this lady at a MUFON meeting in Burbank. Her name is Linda. And I'm just looking at her because she's like staring at me. I'm like, I bet she's psychic. She's like, gives me that look. And I'm talking, I walk up to her, we just start chatting. And I'm like, have you ever seen a UFO? And she's like, yeah, I have had some encounters. I had some really weird stuff happen. I'm like, can I interview you? And she's like, sure. And so she tells me her story. She had a UFO or USO sighting while driving along the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. Just this object on the water, and then boom, it shoots up into the sky. And later had another sighting at a music concert in the canyon in the same sort of Santa Monica mountain area with her boyfriend. And she's had been going to a therapist because she suffered from childhood abuse. And she herself is a therapist, by the way, so pretty good witness. And her therapist is like, I want you, you've got a lot of anxiety and stress. And I think one way to help this to be massage therapy. This can actually bring up buried trauma. I think you should do this. And so she goes to a massage therapist, and she did start remembering UFO dreams. But before that, she started, something really weird happened. She was in the shower and she looks down on her leg, and there's this symbol full on, not a scratch mark. She thought it might be because she has dermographia. Her skin welts up easily. And she's got like overproduction of histamine in her epidermis. So she could scratch herself easily. But this was like a letter or a symbol, but it wasn't anything she recognized. She thought, okay, that's weird. Happened again. And again. So she starts writing them down. And this happened over a period of a year or two. And there was these various obviously meaningful symbols, clearly of intelligent design. And after collecting, a bunch of them, she's like, I can't take this anymore. Goes to the library and looks up Sanskrit or Egyptian hieroglyphs or, anything, a book on symbology, asks her friends, goes to a Masonic temple, cannot get any answers, goes to the New Age Learning Light Center. Nobody had any answers for her. And she finally just gave up, put her notebook away, and because at some point it had stopped. And it's like midnight, 1987 or something. I forget what it was, 1989, around there. And she's watching television and this movie comes on, which she was excited to watch. It was called Intruders by Bud Hopkins. Yep. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a pretty good, one of the better, I think, in terms of accuracy.
Oh yeah, it's a classic in my book.
Yeah. I mean, Fire in the Sky was great. Don't get me wrong, but the onboard segment, terrible. It was just not accurate. And, Steven Spielberg did some good stuff, but it wasn't accurate either. And Close Encounters of the Third Kind was good, but wasn't really about onboard encounters. But Bud Hopkins was a consultant and he really wanted to keep it accurate. And in fact, he wanted to include symbols that were taken from actual cases. So when Ben Vereen, I think was the actor, is pulled on board and sees these symbols, there's another actress, I forget her name. She also saw symbols on board the craft as well. And Linda's watching this with her boyfriend when these people are pulled on board and see these symbols. And her jaw drops, her eyes go wide. She's like, "Oh my God, those are my symbols." And her boyfriend says, "Hey, honey, look, that's what appeared on your body." And she's like, "Yes."
Wow.
So she kind of got her answer, but I mean, yes and no. She's still not sure how this appeared, but that's when she started having these childhood dreams of being, I think one was she was outside by the swing set and this UFO appears, starts letting out little smaller craft and they're all darting around. Another time she's again, this is a weird one too. I've never heard anything quite like this. She's in her backyard. It's a rural area. And she's standing next to these human-looking ETs dressed in jumpsuits. But she's pretty sure they're ETs because there's this beam of light coming down from a craft shining on the field in front of her. And where this beam of light is shining, the landscape starts changing according to the season. So it's going from spring to fall. Spring, fall, winter, the whole progression of seasons, yeah. Spring, summer, fall, winter, and just going back in time. And she's just a little girl and she's like, "Wow, snowflakes." And she starts to go running towards the snow and they grab her like, "No, don't move. It's dangerous." And the flowers come and she's like, "Flowers." And she runs towards them. She's like, "No, you don't move. Don't move. It's dangerous." But they wanted to show her this. She had another dream, which she felt is a true memory, actually, where a UFO is hovering over her house, or actually landed next to her house, shines a beam of light on her house. She's in the front yard with her mom. They're looking at this, and her mom's like, "Quick, get in the house." And Linda's like, "No, I am not going in there. I do not want to get in the time beam again." So I'm like, "Time beam? What do you mean?" She's like, "Well, that's what I don't know what I mean, but that's what I said." Like, oh, that's wild.
That is wild, man. That's a great story. You got so many great stories, Preston.
Yeah, I love this stuff. I just, I realized a year or two ago, I've devoted most of my life to this. This has become my life's work. I'm obsessed. I am. I don't know quite why. Well, it is in my family. I will absolutely admit that.
I was going to ask you, how often are researchers or investigators who maybe haven't previously had any encounter, how many times do they then have encounters after they've been researching or investigating this?
Quite a bit, because that's what first thing that I did when I started, I'm like, oh my God, we're being invaded by aliens. My brother saw a UFO. My sister-in-law saw grays. My other sister-in-law saw little blue beings. I've had my nephews, both of them had sightings. One of my nephews saw humanoids in his bedroom. like, shoot, this is in my family. Have I ever had an encounter? Of course, I'm digging through my childhood. Like, well, I don't really remember anything. There was one weird incident. I do remember where I skipped lunch. I was mad. I'm like, you served lunch? Where was I? And they're like, I don't know. It was weird because I could not have missed lunch and I was mad. I don't know. That's the only thing I can point towards that is anything at all substantial, but nothing, right? So I'm like, well, all right. But so I start researching the stuff. It's like 1988. I'm buying all the books. I'm like, okay, let's interview everybody. It's 89. I've got like 50, 100 books. 1990, I'm joined all the UFO groups. I'm a MUFON field investigator. I am starting to write articles and starting to go on the radio and stuff. And was I? Yeah, I think so. But it was, this is when I'm like neck deep in this. I'm just out of my mind. And it was 1992 that I was at my brother and sister's house, my sister-in-law in Woodland Hills. And it's getting late. And I'm like talking about UFOs all night long. And I'm like, I gotta go, it's work tomorrow. 7-mile drive back to my condo where I lived in Canoga Park. It's late July, 1991, 11 p.m. or so, maybe 12. So I leave their house, take, a little U-turn, going down Golondrina, take one corner, take the next, take a third corner. So I'm maybe 3 minutes away from their house, right? Coming around this hairpin corner. I mean, really tight and steep. So I'm going maybe 3 miles an hour. And I see what I am sure is a bird swooping down towards my car and looking up. It's like, a couple 100 feet up to my right. I instantly see it's not a bird. It's glowing white and it's round. I'm like, well, maybe that's a firecracker because it's late July. And then it comes right in front of my windshield. I'm like, well, that's no firecracker. And it stops in front of my windshield and starts darting back and forth. Stops again, dips down and takes off straight up. That's the last I remember.
Wow.
Did not turn around. Don't remember driving home. Forgot about the entire thing. I did not remember seeing this for months. So pretty sure I had missing time. But it's weird because this thing targeted me. And why? And yes. And then that was a big year. I ended up having like 3 or 4 sightings. And I thought, gosh, do they know about me? Is this possible that because I'm researching it, they're researching me?
Yeah.
And so I started looking into that. And I found out that a lot of researchers have had this experience. And one that comes to mind is Virginia Aronson. She's not super well known, but she also wrote a book about UFO healings following, my book. Because she had her own experience, came across my book and got really into it and ended up interviewing other people. And she found out that she, after she started interviewing people, had an encounter. And Bud Hopkins, he had a sighting and that's got him into it. So some people will have a sighting and that gets them into it, but others will start researching it and end up having sightings. And I've gotten confirmation 3 or 4 times that the ETs do know about me in a crazy way. Just crazy.
Really?
Oh, I think the first time was I asked this lady to go on TV and she's like, sure. She, let me use her real name. Her name is Susan and had encounters in North Hollywood. And it was a great case. And she calls me up like 2 days before this was just a little public access show. Not like, NBC or anything. But she says, I can't do it. I'm like, what do you mean you can't do it? She says, well, the Greys came and they told me they don't want any publicity. And I'm like, well, shoot, they must be watching closely. So they must know that I asked you to go on TV, and once I'm interviewing this guy on the phone and, He calls me up the next day. He's like, you're not going to believe what happened. A UFO landed on the street in front of our house while we were on the phone. I'm like, what do you mean? He says, my son came running in after I hung up with you and said, Daddy, a star landed in the street. He's like 4 or 5 years old. And he's like, what do you mean, son, a star? He's like, bright light, Daddy, bright light. Star landed. Then it got really strange. I mentioned Dolly earlier, the lady I'm interviewing now. She was looking for someone to tell her story. And the ETs said, well, you'll find someone, you'll know it when you see him, and we'll lead you toward him. And it ended up being me. I'm like, oh my God, wow. This is freaking me out.
Yeah, no joke.
And then, get this. This is the weirdest one of all. I got a call from a guy in England. And he's like, are you the Preston Dennett who researches UFOs? I'm like, yeah. He says, oh, great, because I've had an encounter, and they were warning me about nuclear proliferation, and is this anything you've ever heard of? And I'm like, oh, yeah, this is their number one message. They're warning people of pollution, nuclear proliferation, our warlike ways. And he's like, oh, I'm so glad, because, I thought I was going crazy. And he's just going on, and he's like, well, I have one more thing to tell you. I'm like, yeah, anything, because this is my thing, I'm just there to help people. So a lot of people do not want to be interviewed. They just have questions, and that's fine. And he says, well, I have to tell you that, the Greys came down and told me to contact Preston Dennett.
Wow.
That's what I said. I'm like, wait, what? Did you not know about me? He's like, no, I'd never heard of you. They told me about you.
See, you're a bigger part of this than you know, man. You were meant for this.
I guess so. I mean, that's enough to freak you out a little bit.
Yeah, no doubt, man.
No, I'm wondering.
Yeah, you better watch yourself, man. Maybe they are visiting you more often than you think they are.
Yeah, well, it's not the first time I've had, absolute confirmation that something's going on with me personally. One time I'm in my condo, this is 1994 or so, and I interviewed this lady I'll call Wendy. I'm still in touch with her. She's no longer in the U.S. She's in Australia. But I did talk to her recently. We're still in touch. Great lady. Crazy story. She's just full-on contactee, largely conscious now. But I'd interviewed her. She'd been abducted since she's a little girl. Greys would pull her on board. She's had hybrid babies. It was freaking her out, very fear-based in the beginning, but eventually became very spiritual. She was healed. They cured her of a cyst. That's an incredible story in and of itself. Once she woke up and Greys were surrounding her bed, she jumps up and kicks one in the neck, and it goes snap. She says, I think I killed it. I'm like, seriously? She's like, yeah, honest. I feel really bad now, but they scared the living daylights out of me. You just shouldn't come to my room like that. And I'm like, wow, gosh. So I'd interviewed her. I recorded this interview, and I'm thinking, snapped its neck, huh? That's, And I knew of another case where someone had done that, but only one. I've since, talked to people who've, punched them in the face. Well, Travis Walton did. Yeah. I talked to a guy in Louisiana who punched one in the face, a guy in England, same thing. So here's Wendy telling me this, and I'm in my condo late at night transcribing the interview, because I record all my interviews and I transcribe them word for word. I want to get everything accurate. And I remember I'm leaning back in my chair thinking, pretty sure she's telling me the truth. The details are right on. I talked to her face to face. She's very emotional. She had supporting witnesses, by the way. Her family was seeing UFOs, her friends. So it's a good case, but this is a lot to swallow. Yeah. So I'm just leaning back there thinking, this is a crazy case, snapping its neck. And this is when I got an incredibly strong impulse to run under the roof of my condo, which I have never had anything like that happen. And I don't go up there. I mean, I've been up there a few times just because, you're curious. Well, my roof leaked once. I went up there to look. And so next thing I know, I'm up there. Well, actually what happened, the full-on details, I ran down 3 stories to grab my glasses out of my car, which I use for driving. That was it, because I'm only slightly nearsighted. And ran up onto the roof with my glasses on. I'm wearing them. I'm like, well, that's weird. What am I doing up here? Suddenly I realize I'm on the roof. I'm like, huh. And I'm up there maybe 20 seconds. It wasn't a minute. It was maybe, 30 seconds. I'm guessing closer to 15 even, because this UFO, boom, appears like right away. And it's obviously a UFO. It's this bright, bright orange. It was almost spherical, but slightly more oval maybe. Right across the street. The parking lot and the little LA River there. So 200 feet maybe. And at treetop level. I mean, there's palm trees and it's right above the palm trees, right above the apartment across the street. And this thing blasts me with a message. And I've only had that happen once since, but it did happen again years later. And it blasted me with this message, not in words. It's just sort of this impression, but it was clear. I mean, I totally understood what it was saying. It said, "Hi, it's us. We're Wendy's ETs. She's telling the truth. You don't believe, watch this." That was sort of the gist of the message all at once. And this thing darts back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, getting lower and lower and lower. Must have done it about 10 times. And then it winks out. Boy, that freaked me out.
I'll bet, man.
So yeah, they know about me. I'm waiting though, and for them to come to my bedroom and like, "Hey, dude." I'd be like, "Hey, what can you do about my hair loss? Can you cure me?"
Can you cure ugly? That's what I would say. Can you cure ugly? Because I need some curing of that,
But yeah, I'm just gonna underline, they know about me for sure, because I've had the UFO dreams and further sightings. Every now and then, every couple of years, I'll have a sighting. In fact, stop writing, boom, a sighting will, or if I put out a book, and it's always anomalous lights, pretty much, and sometimes just ambiguous enough for like, come on, you can do better than that.
Yeah.
Like real recently, last year, November, I'm out in my backyard like, "You MFers, what? Show yourselves." And this light appears. And I'm like, whoa, because it's way high up in the zenith, but it's, I don't know, 5 times the brightness of a star, much brighter than Venus. It's not a satellite. It's nothing like that. It's not a fireball. It was right where I was looking, which, happens to people I've interviewed, certainly. And it just there for like 3 seconds and then it winks off. I'm like, whoa, is that it? Is that all you got? And at that moment, I see a shape coming overhead. And I'm looking up at it and I'm like, what's that? Because it's a dark night. No, I don't remember if there was a moon or not, but I don't think so. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, that's low. And it's coming right over my head. And it's about 100 to 300 feet high. And it's this huge owl, just this enormous owl. And if you know anything about, UFOs and screen memories, and there's this weird owl connection. Mike Cleland, a great researcher who I love, wrote a book called The Messengers with UFOs and owls.
That's a great,
and this weird owl connection.
Great book too.
Yeah. So I'm looking at that owl go, and it just kind of goes completely silently by, and I watch it. I'm like, all right, that was cool, but still ambiguous.
That's cool though.
Yeah, it was cool, but it still kind of pisses me off a little bit. I'm like, really? Why not just a saucer? How hard could it
be? They're messing with you, man. They're messing with you.
Well, I do live in the San Fernando Valley. There's like 1 million to 2 million people here. So we're sandwiched in. They might not be able to do it.
That is a pretty incredible story, man. And owls, again, it's another crazy aspect of this whole crazy field, like why owls so much? Is it because of the eyes? They're easier to mask the eyes, or is it because, there's just so many questions with that,
Yeah, I don't know, but it's something they've clearly picked to use as a symbol. It is a powerful symbol in our culture, the wise owl. It's in Native American culture. There's something to it. I talked to this one lady. She's driving along with her family, and they had to stop the car because there's a 4-foot owl standing in the middle of the road. And just weird. She had a lot of weird stuff happening. Went outside of her house once, and there's this perfectly pristine, clean pair of long underwear just hanging on a branch. She needed a pair, and it appeared magically.
Wow.
It's just, I don't know if that's connected or not. I'm just saying it, throwing it out there.
It's wild, though. I mean, she better start wishing for $1 million.
Right? But these weird, it can get really weird. Because initially I came into this field, I'm like, UFOs, nuts and bolts, nuts and bolts. Until I'm talking to this lady, she's like, well, my house is haunted. Do you want to hear about that? I'm like, well, ghosts, really? All right, fine. And so ghosts are real. I found out. And one guy, I interviewed him, and he lives in Canyon Country, which is pretty rural. It overlooks the LA National Forest. Had a UFO land in his backyard in 1978. He's a radiologist, a good witness. And he has this, UFO land in his backyard, takes off. It was pretty brief, but a cool incident because, UFO landings are rare. Yeah. No landing trace or anything like that he could tell. But he's like, well, that's not the end of the story. I'm like, well, okay. What happened next? He says, it was the next night that I had a Bigfoot encounter. And I think it's related because it was in the same place. And I had a telepathic connection to it. And it was afraid of my dogs. And it was really angry. And it knew that I could hear it. And it roared like 3 or 4 times. And he saw footprints, went out there. They were not great, not cast worthy. I'm like, wow, that's crazy. I'd never heard of the whole Bigfoot UFO connection at that point. And I'd certainly heard of Bigfoot, but I'm like, I'm not going there. What if it's real? What if Bigfoot is real? This is a can of worms. I'm going to become a Bigfoot researcher, and I'm not ready for that. But of course, I did have to, because that would not be my last UFO Bigfoot case. He's like, wait, it's not done yet. I'm like, oh God, what next? He's like, we had a poltergeist outbreak in the weeks following this incident, and it was bad. Footsteps, cold spots, doors opening and closing, lights going on and off, objects disappearing. So, yeah.
Definitely all connected. I've said for a long time, I believe that all these separate phenomena may not even be as separate as we think that they are,
Yeah, I'm a little bit on the fence about it because some researchers are like, well, these aren't even ETs. And I'm like, well, hold on a second. Let's back up. Because, people are saying, the near-death experience has all these same similarities. And maybe a person isn't even seeing Bigfoot or a UFO or a Sasquatch. And it's all just one thing putting on different masks. And I'm like, I'm not ready to go there. And I really, honestly, Ken, I think that we are dealing with extraterrestrials. Because if you look at the totality of the evidence for the UFO phenomena, we have sightings, right? Lots of sightings. And they look like craft. And they've got windows. And there's ETs coming out of them. And they're almost always humanoid. Pretty much always. And these craft leave radiation marks. Or pressed in the ground really hard. Or even metal fragments. I'm like, okay, well, there's metal to them. They're leaving scars on people's bodies. People who are being taken on board are not where they're supposed to be. They're missing. Right. This is not psychological. I have many cases where people are like, there's a search going on. They're locked out of their house when they're put back.
What about the people that don't come back?
Yeah. Where are they? What is going on here? So they're inside these things. So I'm like, okay, this is pretty darn weird thing to be able to, take you inside a manifestation, right? If that's what it is. And then you get to the implant removal cases. I mean, they're putting stuff in people's bodies, and these implants have been removed by Dr. Roger Leir and others and studied, and they're not normal. So I'm like, okay, well, this is hard evidence.
Right.
And there's other hard evidence. Angel hair has also been analyzed. You've heard of angel hair, I'm sure.
Oh, no. Tell me, because that's a new one for me.
Yeah, angel hair is the substance that's periodically released from UFOs. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised that some people haven't heard of this, because it is relatively rare when you consider there's 100,000 sightings. Well, it's probably 1 million by now. Seriously, on record. But angel hair is this cotton candy, sort of spider web-like substance. And I did a whole study on it. Other researchers have as well, and it's been scientifically studied in a lab numerous times. Normally what happens is there's a volume of this stuff dispersed from the craft. It appears, this is the main theory, to be a byproduct of the high heat levels surrounding these craft, the plasma engines or whatever's going on. This is the theory that's most popular. And it almost always dissolves once it hits the ground or shortly after. But there are a few cases where there's just huge volumes of this stuff, and it's able to be collected, and people stick it in their freezers in little glass jars. And it has been analyzed, cases from France, Australia, Italy, the US has been analyzed, and the ones that are able to get a chemical analysis of it, it's all very similar. There's like, what is it? Manganese, there's boron. I do remember specifically there's boron, which is should not be lying on the ground, and is actually used to shield nuclear materials in our own technology. So that's kind of interesting. So yeah, that's angel hair. This is a physical thing. If this is, why would this be manifesting boron? And why I really think this is ETs, all of that, and the whole contactee stories really looks like ETs to me. This is what they're telling people. We're from here or there. We're reinvigorating our genetics, or they're healing people. There's a lot of evidence that this is something real.
Yeah.
But the crash retrievals, come on.
Right. Yep.
That's not in the public arena. I'll grant you that. It's all resting exclusively on eyewitness testimony. Almost not anymore. Jacques Vallée says he has material. Pentagon said that they have material from otherworldly vehicles. They said it. And, materials. Materials. You have the craft.
Right. The whole damn thing.
They have the bodies. We know this from Roswell. Yep. We know this from the Aztec crash, from Paradise Valley crash in Arizona, from Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's hundreds of these cases. So all bets are off. We know what this is. We in the public arena may not have that proof, but I think the evidence is conclusive at this point, and our own governments have absolute 100% proof that this is extraterrestrial. They know it. Reverse engineered. I've talked to whistleblowers who, been part of projects involving reverse engineering of alien technology. There's aliens. What's the resistance to the fact that there are ETs out there? Just look at the stars. If there are no ETs, if this is not ETs, what are we?
Yep. Yeah.
And that's my main beef with this phenomena theory. Like that, Lauren Coleman, John Keel, Jacques Vallée have put forth. I'm not saying Jacques says everything is, the phenomena, as he puts it. The control system, but maybe it's not ETs. I'm like, well, I think it is, because the problem with that theory is it's anthropocentric. It's saying it's being put on for our benefit. It's all about us.
Yeah.
I'm like, I doubt it's about us. It never is. When has anything ever been about us?
That's kind of human nature, though, to think everything is about us, though, right?
Right. But it turns out science has always disproven that. No, it turns out we're not the center of the universe.
Right.
No, Earth does not, the sun does not revolve around us. We revolve around the sun. There's theory after theory. Just look at that, what's coming out of the Hubble telescope. Man, oh man, take a little tiny section of sky, a postage stamp, and there's 50 galaxies in it.
What do you feel about the theory of some of these ETs are just us from the future? And that's why they're so interested in us.
Yeah. It's a cute theory. I think it's got some attractions to it because there's a weird time aspect to many encounters. We already talked about that case where they can apparently stop time. And I have to tell you, I do know of cases where people have been taken back into what appears to be the past, or they're shown visions of the future, which do take place, disasters, or, someone they're going to meet. That happens numerous times. They're like, you're going to meet this person. You're going to live in this house. This is going to happen at your work. And it does. So they have some weird abilities. They can telescope time. A person is like taken from the scene of a car accident. They're on board for 2 hours and boom, they're put back a minute after the accident.
Wow.
So they're compressing time. They're telescoping time. So they can do stuff with time. And I think that's led to the theory, I think it was Jenny Randall's was the first to put forth, we might want to look at UFOs as time machines rather than craft. And I get it. There is some weird time things, but I search through the cases to find any case that would really speak towards them being us from the future. And there are a few. There's one, I think, from Whitley Strieber. This lady sees the Greys and she said, "Oh, you're so ugly." And they said, "Well, one day you will look just like us." But they did not say they were from the future.
Right. That could mean so many different things. That could mean, you can even put that in with the hybridization thing, but.
Yeah. What if we genetically damage ourselves like they did?
Right.
Which is apparently how they came to look like Greys. But the Greys are essentially human, as near as I can tell. That's my current assessment. Because they're breeding with us. But yeah, there's a few cases you can march out, and there's a couple of books out there that sort of put forth this theory, and I'm like, okay, let's check out this book. And it was almost entirely speculative. And that's my problem with it, is, that's all well and good, and it's a cool idea, but where is, a case study? Show me something. Give me something that I can sink my teeth into that points towards them being us from the future.
Yeah, I guess that was you hit it, man. That was my big argument right there with the whole thing was, there's, it's speculation. There's no real shreds of evidence to backing most of that up,
Yeah, the closest I get, there's like 2 cases from Carla Turner, a good researcher, unfortunately passed away. She had a lady who the ETs told her, "You are us, we are you." She had another client, I guess. I don't want to call him a customer, like a client, someone she's working with. Same message. Kim Carlsberg. She's pretty prominent in the field, wrote a book called Beyond My Wildest Dreams. She got that message. And they will tell this to abductees, contactees. You are one of us, or you were us in a past life, or we are you are us, we are all one. There's a sort of a oneness message that is a pretty strong theme in a number of encounters. But even that's not saying, well, or you from the future.
Right. That could be, there's some pretty good evidence out there to back up the fact that they've been here for a long time and possibly been messing with our DNA for a long time. So that could be even what they're alluding to there.
Yeah. There are many, many cases. The whole hybrid baby phenomenon is that. And there's lots of ancient writings, from the Bible onwards. And indigenous cultures talk about that. They believe that they believe that they are ancestors of the star people.
Yep.
So yeah, I think there is a connection. I think there are human looking aliens out there. And that I'm like, that is weird. Did we even evolve on this planet? There are beings out there that look just like us. And why are they all bipedal? Why aren't we seeing tentacled aliens? Where's the blob? And that's kind of what I thought aliens would look like. Something so completely different that it would be beyond our imagination.
Yeah, but most of them, like you said, are humanoid.
Yeah, and some people say, well, maybe they're not extraterrestrial, but crypto-terrestrial. And I thought that was an interesting idea.
Yeah, very.
Because we have cryptozoology, where there are beings living here that haven't identified or verified, I should say, in mainstream science, like Bigfoot, which has clearly been here for hundreds of years, if not thousands. And maybe they're not extraterrestrials. Maybe the Greys or the Reptilians, I think speak towards that, are not extraterrestrial at all. They're would be better termed crypto-terrestrial. The Reptilians, I think, I would say probably, because I've got a few reptilian cases, and neither of them, I only have a couple. I don't get a lot for whatever reason. None of them have UFOs. And often people will just see these things out in like the Everglades or out in the forest or somewhere out in the wilderness.
Or in Washington, D.C. or anything like that.
I hope not. I'm not going to rule it out. It would explain some things, but
I like the crypto terrestrial thing. I like it for a couple of reasons. I like it for the USO cases, and I like it for the cases that where UFOs have been spotted near cave systems and things like that.
Yeah, but it just doesn't hold water, though. It doesn't, because people see these things going. They don't always go down into the earth. There are a few cases. And yeah, there's a bunch of USO cases. But when someone sees these things, they drop down out of the sky. Or a star-like object, then they drop down, and then they return to the sky and come this tiny little speck, and boom, they're gone.
That's true. That is very true.
And people who have been taken on board, there are some of them who have seen what they believe to be other planets. And some of these are really well authenticated cases. Carl Higdon, Rawlins, Wyoming. It's a classic case. There were witnesses who saw UFOs in the area that he was taken. His truck was found out in the middle of a field, no tracks to it. He had medical evidence. He was healed of tubercular scars and kidney stones. So a good case. And he was pulled into this craft, and he says they took him to another planet. That's what he remembers. So there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, and people say, oh, well, maybe they're interdimensional. I'm like, okay, here we have another vague theory, which doesn't really, it's not that helpful, right? I'm like, what's interdimensional? How would you define that? And this is, I think, a theory which comes up because we do see these craft disappear, turning at right angles, seemingly defying the laws of physics. But of course, just because it looks like magic doesn't mean it is, because they have technology. And the fact is, yeah, maybe they are interdimensional. I'll grant you that, but what isn't?
True.
Quantum physics has identified other dimensions. And if you study parapsychology and near-death experiences, astral travel, out-of-body experiences, ghosts, there's another side. There's a higher dimension that we go to. If you look at mediumship, channeling, there is good evidence for life after death and another side, a different dimension. So we are interdimensional.
That is very true.
And what isn't? What isn't interdimensional?
Yeah, that's very
Everything.
true. You're right about that. I mean, yeah, man. See, you're making me think, Preston. I like it. No,
Hey, that's my job. I'm on a mission.
you are, man. I enjoy talking with you so much. I have one other question for you. How often do you get claims from people who have been abducted that have seen other creatures or animals or something weird like that on these craft? Because I have a story to tell you about that. But how often do you hear that?
Not a lot. I know Betty Andreasen reported seeing weird kind of 2 foot tall things with these long stalks and eyes in the tip and sort of webby hands. And that's not normal. That is definitely, and I started looking for cases of this. And I think what prompted it was Katarina Wilson, Oregon-based abductee, was taken on board and did report weird animals. She saw like this weird gorilla-like creature, this what looked like a cat, but it wasn't a cat. And so I started looking at other cases. I'm like, because we know ETs are collecting animals. I mean, we know this. People have seen cows being pulled on board, rabbits, chickens, dogs. RD6 Killer Clark has a case where they were lifting alligators out of a lake. And there's a lot of cases of this. And people have been taken on board and seen what looks like an arboretum or a forest. Full on. John Mack had a case where the lady was taken on board. It was a pine forest on board a UFO. Yep. RD6 Killer Clark has a couple of cases of this. So I started looking at all this. I'm like, yeah, there are cases where people have seen, I think it was Daryl Sims said he had cases of people pulled on board and saw dinosaur-like creatures. Betty Andreasen talked about seeing, what looked like Neanderthals and other animals. And Dolly, I will tell you, I asked her about this because she's a full unconscious contactee. I can't wait to get this book out because she talked quite a bit about this. And she's like, there's some stuff I can't tell you. I'm like, well, just tell me. She's like, yes, they have large, not zoos because they don't think of it that way, but animal enclosures. I'm like, okay, have you seen animals on board? She's like, oh, yeah. Earth animals and non-earth animals. And they're all very similar. There are antelope type creatures which are not native to Earth. She says, I will tell you that the ETs told me that giraffes are not native to Earth.
Wow.
And I thought that was interesting because I remember they were teaching evolution in school. I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. And they're like, yeah, all mammals came from the lemur. I'm like, really? All of them? And they're like, yeah. And it took about 200 million years. I'm like, okay. 200 million years and a lemur turned into an elephant?
Right.
And a giraffe and all the things we see on Earth, all the mammals you're telling me came from a lemur. And I'm just, I don't know. And I started charting it. Me as a 15-year-old kid was like, well, that would mean, every million years, there just wasn't enough time.
Yeah.
So now I'm thinking there's something else going on here. And Dolly speaks to that in, the interviews I've done with her. That would be a whole other show. But
yeah, we'll have to do that one.
Yeah, she's described dinosaur-like creatures, moose that are like twice the normal size, and all kinds of stuff. And I'm like, oh my God. She's kept quiet. She's like, why have you kept quiet? She's like, are you kidding? No one is going to believe me. And the things she's told me, I've heard piecemeal from, just very little she's told me that I haven't heard somewhere from someone. Before. Yeah. There's, definitely unique elements, but I'm like, no, Dolly, I've heard this. She's like, you have? I'm like, yes. I've heard this before from other people. She's like, have you ever heard of anyone like me? I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, who's awake? I'm like, well, no, there's Jim Sparks. He's pretty well known for being a fully conscious contactee. He wrote an excellent book. And I do interview people who've had full conscious encounters, but not like her. Man, oh man.
Yeah, I was asking about that because I spoke to a guy who is an abductee, and he was on board, and you kind of hit on a couple of the points there. So it's kind of confirmation for me, and it will be for him once I tell him. But he said that when he was taken aboard this craft, there were sections of this craft that were like the forest, and there were animals in these sections that were different, and these weren't big enclosures that these things were in at all, but there was just enough, like a zoo almost. And he said the one, he had woken up and was walking around trying to figure out where the hell he was, and he ran into this dog. He said it wasn't really a dog, but it was a dog, and it stunk really bad, and it scared the living crap out of him. And then, yeah, like during his fear, it must have alerted these aliens, and they calmed him down and took him back and did their thing with him after that. But he said that he will never ever forget the way that thing smelled and the way its eyes looked at him. It was a dog, but it was bigger than a dog, and it wasn't really a dog, but it was a dog, you know? It was fascinating the way he explained it.
Yeah, that's crazy. I think there's genetics throughout the universe. I really do.
Yeah.
And people have been abducted with their pets. I've heard that. There was one guy in Arizona, sort of a frontiersman, was pulled on board, and his dog was there too. And his dog jumps towards the graves, and so they paralyzed the dog, and it's just floating around like a stuffed animal. He said the entire duration of the contact experience, which was actually, yeah, funny. It was pretty friendly overall.
It's pretty funny.
They're like, this is what they did to Hunter Bone was the dog's name.
That's awesome, man. That is awesome. Oh, man. Well, hey, Preston, where can everybody get your books, contact you if they have an experience, or, just get a hold of you in general?
Yeah, well, at bookstores, if you can find one.
Right.
And online retailers like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and there's others. I do have a website, prestondennett.weebly.com, or just punch in my name. It should take you there.
It does.
On Twitter, Facebook, I've got a new YouTube channel. Well, just over a year old, which is growing fast and having a lot of fun with that. And, I love hearing from people. And yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Ken. I really appreciate it.
You're one of my favorite people to talk to. So I really do appreciate you, man. And I thank you so much.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime.
Well, that about does it for Dreamland Tonight, dreamers. Thanks again for listening, and good night.